Hello everyone, and welcome to this this seminar. My name's Ron Glanville. I'm a former Chief Veterinary Officer in Queensland, and I've been coordinating a group of former Chief Veterinary Officers who are trying to advocate for action on climate change, and I guess that's why I've been asked to introduce this session with Mark Schipp, who's a current Australian Chief Veterinary Officer. I might start by saying, in the spirit of reconciliation, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where we're all located today, and I'd like to pay respect to elders past, present and future, and acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. Just on that subject, I'd also like to mention that I was in Torres Strait last week, and I was able to meet with a number of traditional owners up there who are actually taking action against the federal government on climate change in terms of a legal action over their human rights. So I was able to congratulate them on the action they're taking. So just make the point, this issue is really important for our traditional owners of our country as well. When I was on Buigu Island, which is about as far north as you can get, and you can see the Papua New Guinea coast from the shore, they were telling me that their cultural relatives over the water are already having to move their gardens inland because of the inundation from salt water. So it is affecting people directly now. You'll note that I've put in the chat room some housekeeping issues, so I'll just quickly go through those. Certainly, please feel free to keep your webcam on so that the speakers can see who's on the webinar. I think it makes it a little bit easier for speakers if they can see who they're talking to. But keep your microphones muted, just so that we minimise the background noise. So when the speakers are talking, just please stay on mute. If you have any questions that come up during the course of the talk from Mark, please post any questions into the chat session, then I can go back through those at the end. And if we missed your question at the end and would like to know more, there's also an email address there, info@vfca.org.au, where you can email questions. So I'd like to introduce our speaker for this afternoon. We're very fortunate, I think, to have Mark Schipp. Mark's the current Chief Veterinary Officer for Australia. He's been in that position since 2011. Mark was also, when I was Chief Veterinary Officer Queensland and on Animal Health Committee, Mark was also a member of Animal Health Committee back in those days, before then as the representative from AQUIS. Mark is also currently Australia's delegate to the World Animal Health Organisation, the OIE, and its currently elected president. I think he finishes up that role later on this year. As Australian CVO, Mark leads Australia's national responses to emerging animal diseases, surveillance, prevention, all those various things that we do in biosecurity. And he also has a keen interest in strengthening veterinary services within our region in our neighbouring countries. And one thing that Mark's been particularly active on is leading Australia's agricultural response to the global threat of antimicrobial resistance. But Mark's also obviously got an interest in climate change as well. So I will hand over to Mark, who's going to talk to us about climate change from the perspective of the World Animal Health Organisation. So over to you, Mark.
Thanks very much, Ron, and it's lovely to see everybody here. I'll try and share my screen, and it worked on the trial, so we'll give that a go. How's that?
Yes, that's good. We can see it. Yes.
Very good. Thank you. So as Ron said, I and the Chief Veterinary Officer of Australia. I was appointed to this role in 2011. Prior to that, I'd worked in the West Australian government and in export abattoirs, in the meat export program. I had a couple of overseas postings in Seoul, South Korea, and in Beijing, China, but was appointed as a CPO in 2011 at the time of the Indonesian live cattle crisis, and was elected to the OIE Council in 2012. The OIE Council is the board of the OIE, and I became a member in 2012. In 2015, was elected as the Vice President and then as President for this 3-year period, which, as Ron says, finishes mid-year, and then I'll be past President for the remaining 3 years. And my responsibility as Australia's Chief Veterinary Officer is to try and provide objective, overarching and strategic advice to government and an overview of Australia's animal health system to identify threats and opportunities to Australia's animal agriculture sector. And of course, it's impossible to overlook the threat that climate change poses, both the potential range and the magnitude of impact. There's a recent photo of me. The photographer told me it turned out very well, and I'm not so pleased with it myself. So we'll move on to this slide, which is the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report for 2021, was recently released, and it confirmed what many of you already know, that climate change continues to be a catastrophic global risk. Climate action failure was considered to be the second top global risk by likelihood and the second top global risk by impact. And unlike infectious diseases, this is a threat to which no one is immune. Global temperatures have already risen by 1.1 degrees Celsius since the pre-industrial period, and 2020 was the hottest year on record for both Europe and Asia. And although worldwide lockdowns have caused global emissions to fall over the last year, we know from the 2008-2009 financial crisis that these can bounce back very rapidly. A shift to climate action and greener economies cannot be delayed until the shocks of the pandemic subside. We simply don't have time. So the known impacts of climate change are many, and as sentient beings, both domestic and wild animals will suffer those impacts. And some of those impacts on animals we can foresee, or in fact have already been demonstrated. So the more visible of these come from extreme weather. We know that flooding can drown and displace livestock and wildlife, and we're experiencing that this week. It can also wash pesticides and waste and fecal material into water systems and oceans shared by animals and humans. Heavy rains on cattle pasture upstream to water treatment plants may have contributed to the cryptosporidium outbreak in Milwaukee in 1993, which was the largest waterborne disease incident in the US history, which affected 25% of that state's population. We know that heat waves and drought will mean fewer water sources and less vegetation, and that's essential for animal food and protection. Pets, livestock and wildlife will suffer greater dehydration and heat stress, and vets will be on the front line in responding to this. We know that cyclones result in physical damage to our coral reef. Cyclone Yasi in 2011 damaged 15% of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. And while it's unlikely that fewer tropical cyclones will form as the climate warms, a higher proportion of those that do will be intense, and modelling indicates their global distribution may change. Equally visible are bushfires. The implications for bushfires on animals is fresh in my mind as we recently passed the 1-year anniversary of Australia's Black Summer. And I fully expect that we'll have more black summers in future years. An impact report released in November confirmed that this was one of the worst wildlife disasters in modern history, with almost 3 billion animals, both mammals, birds, reptiles and frogs impacted. Other impacts may be more insidious. Rising ocean levels will lead to increased risks of coastal flooding and waterborne zoonoses, as Ron just mentioned. And this is particularly relevant for our Pacific neighbours. More frequent marine heat waves are predicted to increase the incidence of algal blooms and the distribution of species, with reef ecosystems being particularly susceptible to minute temperature changes. And disease distribution will be impacted by changes to vector occurrence or animal migration patterns. Some diseases, such as Rift Valley fever, will be affected by both. So all of these are known animal impacts, and indeed a number of these are being experienced by us at this very moment. But what else is to come? And part of my role, and I think all of our roles, is to try and predict what might eventuate. And to follow this thinking, a recently published paper in the journal Science of the Total Environment concluded that climate change may have played a key role in the evolution and transmission of severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS, and COVID-19. It finds that climate change shifted the global distribution of bats, the likely zoonotic source of these diseases, and it drove a concentration of bat richness in an area bordering China, Myanmar, and Laos, a hotspot that the authors estimate accounted for an increase in the order of 100 bat-borne coronaviruses across the region. The currently unpredicted effects will remind us of the natural world's interconnectedness and the critical needs to approach this threat with a One Health lens. One Health, as you know, recognises that the health of people is closely connected to the health of animals and our shared environment. And One Health is not new, but it has become more important in recent years. This is because many factors have changed interactions between people, animals, plants, and our natural environment. There is no doubt that we as a global community need to take action, and as veterinarians, none of us should ignore the impact of agriculture on climate. Just like other human activities, the agricultural sector plays a role in exacerbating the effects of climate change. Scientific evidence concludes that animal production contributes 14.5% of global greenhouse emissions. With the rapid update of renewable energy and other technologies that we're witnessing, we're likely to see that this percentage increase in coming years as agriculture's relative contribution becomes larger. However, the relationship between the climate and agriculture sector is complex, with each having the ability to negatively impact upon the other. Animal-based agricultural production will be affected, along with the livelihood, health, and food security that it supports. And you'll see at the top of this slide a quote from the Director General of the OIE, Dr. Monica Awan, that we should resist blaming animal production as if it were a separate and unconnected aspect of our lives. Whether we agree with animal production or not, we must acknowledge the vital role it plays in feeding and providing livelihoods for millions of people globally, many of whom are among the world's most vulnerable. The graph on this slide reflects research on the role of the livestock sector in developing and emerging economies projected to 2030 and beyond. And the research concluded that the human population is expected to increase from 7.2 to 9.6 billion by 2050, and the global demand for livestock products is expected to double by 2050. There will be increasing demand for animal proteins, particularly within Asia, and global meat and milk production is expected to increase significantly. Cruelly, the climate impacts that will adversely affect livestock production at the same time when animal products will be in most demand. This leaves a key question: how do we encourage and support sustainable livestock and agriculture production while striking a balance between mitigating climate change and meeting the demands of a growing global population. Stepping away from blame, we must search for innovative and accessible ways for the agricultural sector to adapt. There is an urgent need to mitigate the effects of climate change while at the same time adapting to develop resilience to the effects that we cannot avoid. We must acknowledge that many societies do not have the capacity or infrastructure to radically change their agricultural and food production sectors, and that change will take time, be incremental, and require leadership. This leadership may not come from a single source, but from a combination of global institutions, governments, industry bodies, and individuals. And one such institution, of course, is the UN Food and Agricultural Organization, or FAO, which has a dedicated program called Climate Smart Agriculture. This is an approach that helps to guide actions needed to transform and reorientate agricultural systems to effectively support development and ensure food security in a changing climate. Climate Smart Agriculture aims to tackle three main objectives. Firstly, to sustainably increase agricultural productivity and incomes. Secondly, to adapt and build resilience to climate change. And finally, to reduce or remove greenhouse gas emissions where possible. Many of the green slides on this, green tiles on this slide are approaches that Climate Smart Agriculture is supporting. The FAO has developed training programs that are designed to be tailored to local contexts and varying scales of production. The training aims to enable farmers to adapt their long-term farming systems to new climate conditions while natural resources are expected to become increasingly limited. Another global organisation with a leadership role, of course, is the World Organization for Health, the OIE, particularly in supporting veterinary systems. The World Organization for Health, known by its French acronym OIE, was established in 1924 with headquarters in Paris, and this predates the United Nations by over 20 years. It is the intergovernmental organisation responsible for improving animal health, animal welfare, and veterinary public health worldwide, on terrestrial and aquatic production systems, and for wildlife. The OIE has a total of 182 member countries and maintains permanent relations with nearly 75 other international and regional organisations, and it has regional and sub-regional representations on every continent. And in our region, regional representation is in Tokyo and our sub-regional representation is in Bangkok. This slide contains the OIE's objectives, and as you'll read them, I'm sure you'll agree that these are essential elements to achieving a coordinated and effective veterinary contribution to climate action at the global level. The OIE is uniquely placed to respond to the climate change challenge, and the OIE can offer global reach, truly international perspectives, and technical expertise that ranges from epidemiology and project management to communication. One of its key attributes is acting as a partner to strengthen veterinary services at the global, regional, and national levels, and it does this through listening to and building capacity in its member countries. In 2019, the OIE surveyed member countries to evaluate which issues they believed would impact the work and the functioning of their veterinary services. And the results on this slide display the issues that the veterinary services from member countries believe will be the highest priority versus what they believe that their stakeholders see as high priorities. In brief, the survey found that disease outbreaks, zoonoses, and antimicrobial resistance were the factors of highest importance to veterinary services, but it also indicated that they were well prepared to face these factors. Extreme weather and reduction in greenhouse gases were ranked lower in the survey. In some ways, this is not surprising. As stated by Dr. Monica Awad, the Director General, the current modus operandi of veterinary services is to be responsive to the immediate effects of disease outbreaks and animal welfare issues. They likely know and accept that there are causal links between climate conditions and disease emergence, but may feel that they are unequipped to respond to the technically challenging consequences on animal health as a result of climate change. And this highlights a necessary mental and operational shift for our profession, away from focusing on what's immediate and to one of focusing on what is emerging and how we might adapt and respond to those emerging issues. Veterinary services are familiar with responding to technical problems. In fact, self-image is historically centred on this. We determine the source of a disease outbreak, titrate an adequate amount of pain relief, ensure meat is safe to eat, or stop a patella from luxating. However, climate change is an adaptive challenge. There are problems where the solutions are difficult to identify and confront our deeply held beliefs, values, or ways of working. To effectively address climate change, the veterinary profession must evolve to face adaptive challenges. We must be better prepared to respond to the complex multitude of challenges which require a broader array of knowledge and perspective than traditionally covered in veterinary schools. Ron Heifetz, a global authority on leadership from Harvard University, once said the single biggest failure of leadership is to treat adaptive challenges like technical problems. Supporting this evolution is a key challenge for the OIE. In assessing how the OIE can achieve this, it is worth considering the strategic plan which will guide the organisation's direction over the next 5 years. And since 1990, the OIE has adopted a strategic planning cycle for its 5-year work program, and this ensures that the organisation remains highly relevant by tackling the most pressing issues facing OIE member countries in a coordinated and efficient manner. And what you can see on the screen here are the pillars of the draft 7th strategic plan that is expected to be adopted at the OIE's general session in May of this year. The 5 pillars were developed through a detailed consultation process across all OIE member countries and regional representations. All the pillars have a role to play in supporting veterinary services to face adaptive challenges such as climate change. For instance, we know that an appreciation and respect for scientific expertise is critical to understanding and responding to climate change. As a standard-setting body, the OIE has developed an evidence-based approach that is central to the independence, neutrality, and relevance of its outputs and networks. And then in an increasingly politicised world, the OIE must unashamedly promote transparent and evidence-based approaches. We also know that collaboration with partners will be essential, as veterinary services cannot address the scale or complexity of climate challenge alone. Climate change is a global challenge that needs global solutions. The OIE has valuable partners, such as the tripartite comprising the WHO, the World Health Organization, the FAO, and a recent addition, the United Nations Environment Programme. Collaborations like these enhance the OIE's contributions to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals in the face of a global adaptive challenge such as climate change. However, on the next 2 slides, I'll focus on data governance and responding to members' needs. These are 2 pillars that hold the greatest potential to support the evolution of veterinary services. It's recognised that climate change is going to alter the distribution and frequency of disease events and potentially lead to the emergence of new diseases. This will increase the need for data governance that permits timely disease reporting and information sharing. The OIE is pursuing a digital transformation agenda that recognises its role as a steward for strategically important data assets. The development of a robust data governance strategy will ensure that data management is geared towards producing efficient and meaningful data analysis. This will support the OIE and National Veterinary Services in making informed, fact-based decisions. Surveillance and monitoring efforts will assist with the identification of long-term trends and pinpoint emerging disease hotspots requiring immediate attention. This was one of the drivers for the redesign and upgrade of the OIE's animal health database, the World Animal Health Information System, or WAHIS. OIE WAHIS is the name of the new system, and it emerged following a multi-year project, and it was launched earlier this month. This is a unique and comprehensive database of officially validated animal health data that replaces and significantly extends WAHIS. Information on the animal health situation worldwide, which was reported and disseminated throughout the world. OIE WAHIS data reflects the information gathered by veterinary services of OIE members and non-member countries and territories on OIE-listed diseases in domestic animals and wildlife, as well as on emerging diseases and zoonoses. New features of the platform make reporting of animal diseases simpler and more intuitive, and an innovative geospatial system allows for more precise reporting, making it easier to control outbreaks. Easy access and visualization of the information facilitates the overview and analysis of the state of animal health worldwide. One of the most critical elements in relation to climate change is a new public interface, making information about animal health easily available and usable to everybody who needs it: government agencies, trading partners, international organisations, researchers, academics, civil society and journalists, and it continues to be free of charge. Users now have access to extended data mining with tools for extraction, opening up a new era of opportunity in data analysis. It's likely that in coming years, data extraction, interactive mapping tools and dashboards available through OIE WAHIS will play a critical role in understanding and predicting animal disease changes brought about by climate change. The OIE also works to strengthen the veterinary services of member countries, and not all member countries have equally funded or resourced veterinary systems, which impacts their ability to be more preemptive and less reactive. Capacity building of veterinary services is a key enabler for risk mitigation and management, and veterinary services need adequate resourcing, training and encouragement to fully understand their role in addressing threats and opportunities. The OIE's capacity building is delivered through an established global network, building on existing experience and expertise. With the support of its network of reference centres, the OIE helps to foster changes to the veterinary services that are better equipped to anticipate and respond to new expectations. The OIE has a proven track record in strengthening veterinary services, particularly over the last decade through its flagship program, Performance of Veterinary Services, or PVS, the pathway program which ensures mature development of veterinary services through standardised evaluation, gap analysis and support. And it does this by evaluating veterinary services and providing a comprehensive understanding of their strengths and weaknesses, using a globally consistent methodology based on international standards. It's often useful to have an external perspective that can reveal gaps, inefficiencies and opportunities for innovation within a government service. And the PVS pathway shifts away from an externally driven short-term emergency response of type of vertical approach to one that addresses a more sustainable long-term strengthening or horizontal approach to systems. The process targets capacity building and good governance of veterinary services to improve both aquatic and terrestrial animal health and welfare via improved compliance with OIE standards. And the OIE also works to build resilience in veterinary services by working with partners to improve disaster preparedness. The role of veterinary services will be increasingly important in preparedness, response and recovery within emergency management systems. And we see that with evacuation responses to fire and flood, where people are unwilling to move if they can't take their pets or livestock with them. The OIE assists member countries by supporting preparedness exercises based on future scenarios, examining climate change, population growth, globalisation, competition for resources, creating regional conflicts and natural disasters, in order to predict disease emergence and international spread. And veterinary services may be called upon at any moment. Therefore, it's important to utilise the information and tools provided by the OIE, for example, guidelines on disaster management and risk reduction in relation to animal health and welfare and veterinary public health. So while I'm confident that the OIE as a modern and science-based organisation is committed to tackling climate change, the organisation faces its own challenges in doing this. Firstly, on prioritisation, the OIE is an organisation that works to serve its members. It relies heavily on them to set the organisation's priorities through established consultation mechanisms. And accordingly, the priority given by the organisation to climate action is a reflection of the members' own priorities. We've already discussed how veterinarians and veterinary services have a historical tendency to focus on immediate effects of disease outbreaks and animal welfare issues. Member countries need to lift their vision and need to ensure that the OIE has a strong mandate for forward-looking work on climate action. While holding the presidency, one of my three target areas has been increasing the engagement and participation of all member countries, especially those that may have been historically less engaged. These are often those that are less well-resourced and that are at the greatest threat from climate change, such as our Pacific neighbours, and it's critical that their voice is heard. Secondly, on coordination, the OIE is inherently a large and complex organisation, and while its organisational agility and flexibility are key strategic aims, there are, of course, limitations and challenges when representing 182 member countries. The OIE must continue to modernise and adopt best practice governance and administration, including through virtual mechanisms to rise to challenges as significant as climate change. Pursuing best practice governance and transparency within the OIE is another of the three target areas during my presidency. Remit. The OIE is not a supranational power. It does not have any regulatory or enforcement role in the activities of its member countries. Its strengths in addressing climate change lie in increasing capacity, coordination, understanding and motivation internationally. However, the impetus for action rests with national governments. And finally, on funding, the OIE receives both compulsory and voluntary funding from member countries. However, does not enjoy the level of resourcing of many other intergovernmental organisations. This is reflected in staff salaries and the scope of work that is able to be undertaken. I'm one of many who's been keen to see the level of compulsory contributions rise so that the OIE is better resourced to tackle contemporary issues that are global and complex. So while the challenge for the OIE and veterinary services is large, we can be motivated by several factors. Firstly, the contribution of agricultural production to greenhouse gas emissions means that veterinary services and farmers play a key role in climate change mitigation. There is scope for our efforts to be genuinely meaningful on the world stage and for our efforts to reinforce the value of veterinary services to society. And secondly, climate change is but one adaptive challenge facing veterinary services and the societies that they serve. While tackling climate change will require significant resources, capacity building and determination, these will stand us in good stead. The efforts that we put into evolving to become more preemptive and collaborative will also serve us well for a range of other critical challenges. And these include protecting common goods such as antimicrobial efficiency. Antimicrobial resistance is increased by unregulated access and uneducated use of antibiotics in agriculture and aquaculture. And there is well-placed fear that without appropriate stewardship, we are approaching a post-antibiotic era where we will be unable to treat simple infections. Another that is fresh in everybody's mind is the risk of zoonotic disease emergence, including those with pandemic potential. As we've seen with COVID-19, zoonotic transmission of disease can devastate human and animal health. And since early 2020, Australia has taken a leadership role in pursuing global reforms aimed at reducing the zoonotic pandemic risk associated with high-risk animal high-risk human uses of wildlife. In April last year, I jointly signed a letter in my capacity as OIE President with the OIE Director General that was sent to all 182 OIE member countries. It urged their action and support for reducing risks posed by wildlife wet markets and sustainable transformation of food production systems to meet the world's needs for food security is another noteworthy challenge. I think it's also worth noting that all of these additional adaptive changes that I've listed here on the slide are also affected Finally, veterinarians have a greater appreciation than many as to what stands to be lost. Many of us marvel daily at the wonder of nature, and we know firsthand the distress of animal suffering. The impact of climate change on animal and human health, security, social well-being, and the environment has never been more evident than today, and the situation is not simple. Agriculture impacts climate change, and climate change impacts agriculture. Food production must increase at the exact same time that it is being challenged. And emergency veterinary responses to climate impacts rely heavily on the exact resources that are likely to be compromised, that is electricity, refrigeration, and heating. However, this is not a challenge that we can shy from. With a better understanding of the need for cross-sectional collaboration comes the awareness that isolated responses to climate change can be counterproductive. Responding to climate change will require global cooperation from multiple stakeholders, including public-private partnerships. As a result, the role of the OIE in responding to climate change cannot be underestimated, specifically the crucial role of strengthening its network of strategic partners to enact a proactive and cooperative global climate change response. On an individual level, I encourage veterinarians and other specialist professions to come together and share expertise and experience and resources. The world is becoming more familiar with the adoption of a One Health approach, and it is clear intersectoral and multidisciplinary expertise will be crucial to addressing emerging threats. At an international level, I sincerely hope that organisations such as the OIE fulfil their potential to bind international community together and catalyse transformation. So I'd like to thank the Veterinarians for Climate Action for the opportunity to speak today. Many of those involved in organising today's seminar are volunteers, and I often emphasise the need for the veterinary community to have a stronger voice, to use our scientific literacy and perspectives for the good of society, to adopt a One Health mindset, and to rise to tackle the greatest challenges our world faces. There is no better recent example of this than the establishment of Veterinarians for Climate Action, and my appreciation to all involved is gratefully offered. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mark. Maybe if you unshare your screen now, that's great. Well, that was a fantastic presentation, Mark. You've covered a lot of ground. In many ways, you know, when we get a presentation like that, it's almost overwhelming, the challenges. But as you said, we can't shy away from it. You know, the alternative is not good at all. So, and I think what you've really emphasised to me is what, you know, that there's a huge amount that the veterinary profession can do, and a role that we can play in all of this. And there's a huge variety of ways that we can play a role, you know, from, you know, disease impacts to animal welfare to agriculture more generally. So I think that, yeah, the challenge is there before us. We're going to open up for questions and discussion. So I can just encourage people, you can either put a question into the chat and I'll go through all those. There's also a hands up feature in Zoom. Depends on the version you've got. Some of them there'll be a hands up thing at the bottom of your screen. Others you have to click on the reactions button at the bottom of your screen to raise your hand. So see if you can figure out how to do that. I might ask, as facilitator, I'll ask the first question myself, and I suppose it comes down to, you were talking about adaptation, etc. So it seems to me there's two broad areas where the veterinary profession can play a role. One is just general advocacy for for action on climate change, to reduce greenhouse gases, etc. Because as we all know, there's a lot we need to do to get our governments to take stronger action. So that's one role we can play. The other one is in this whole area of adaptation, dealing with disease outbreaks, ensuring that agricultural industries are ready to cope with the impacts of climate change, which we're going to see some of those impacts. Even if we take much stronger action now, there will still be impacts. We can't stop it all. So do you have a view on where we're best putting out our efforts into those two broad areas, or should it be both?
I think it very much needs to be both, and neither alone will make a significant contribution or sufficient contribution. We need to pick up the tools that allow us to adapt to climate change, recognising that it's inevitable and progressive, and that means shifting forms of agriculture and locations of agriculture in some cases. But at the same time, we also need to be trying to ensure that they have a smaller impact. So that means looking at the greenhouse gas emissions and the other contributors to climate change that the livestock sector is making, and trying to ensure that we can address those. And I think the work that the CSIRO have done with the kelp additive to feed, which reduces methane production, is a good example of that. But again, alone, it's not a silver bullet. It needs to be part of an arsenal, an array of tools that we use.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Okay, well, I'll go through some of the questions on the chat. The first one's from Ken Kogel, who asks, in respect to demand for animal products doubling by 2050, he said, correct him if he's wrong, what assumptions underpin that prediction, and what probabilities apply to the assumptions?
So that modelling has been repeated a number of times and is a fairly consistent finding. And it's driven by a strong move into the middle class of the bulk of the population in Asia, and an increasing move out of poverty in Africa. And with those moves, there is a parallel demand for increased protein and increased quality and quantity of that protein. And so that drives a doubling of food requirements, even though the population itself is only increasing by a third.
Right, good. The next question's from Jeanette Kessels, and if people aren't aware, Jeanette's the President of Vets for Climate Action. If you want to wave your hand, Jeanette, I can't see you on the screen actually. There she is. So, and the other person I'll introduce is Ben Cox, who's the CEO of Vets for Climate Action. So Ben, Ray, give us a wave as well. Thank you. So Jeanette's asking, once we have a firm foundation in Australia, how might Vets for Climate Action best contribute internationally to make a real impact?
I think we have a number of vets, and I can see a few on screen that are working in the international sphere in our region, and I think our region is going to be particularly heavily affected by the impacts of climate change, but also by the need to reform animal agriculture. And so I think at a very practical level, veterinary consultants and veterinary practitioners working in our region are able to make that contribution. Internationally, I spoke to Jeanette earlier in the week and said that I'd be happy to contribute at an international level, both through my current role as Australian Veterinary Officer, Chief Veterinary Officer, also in my role in the OIE. But within our region, I've been asked to, when I finish my term as President of the OIE mid-year, to turn my attention to our immediate neighbours of Indonesia, Timor-Leste, Papua New Guinea and the Pacific, and to try and lead work in that region. And I think being climate change aware is a critical part of that work and that contribution. And so I'd be very pleased to contribute in that way if I can. But as I said, I think there's an enormous amount of expertise amongst the membership here that can add to international activity. Further, I think there are a number of international veterinary bodies that are recognising the impact of climate change, and there is an appetite for a similar groundswell of activity as we've seen here with Vets for Climate Action within Australia.
Yeah. I think you're right about the assistance to our Pacific Island neighbours as well. I'm doing a little bit of work out there myself, and there are some of those countries don't have any veterinarians at all, so it's pretty difficult for them to plan for disease outbreaks, etc., when they haven't got any vets. So Australia can play a big role there. We've got a question here from Honey. One idea, perhaps, emphasise the vast increase in animal use, abuse, crowding, stress in order to feed the vast increase in human population. And in brackets, we are a bit like a mouse plague. So I suppose the underlying question there is, in terms of increasing animal production, how can we do that in a more animal welfare friendly way?
Yeah, and that's a key tension as populations become more affluent. They want the food to be clean and green and cheap and really readily affordable, and they want it to be welfare friendly. And it's difficult to deliver on all of those expectations at the same time in a consistent way. But I think that veterinarians are one of the professions that are most well equipped to provide that advice and to provide that input. I think that certain forms of agriculture and animal agriculture in particular won't be acceptable into the future for much longer, and we as veterinarians need to be advising industry of that and helping them to make that adjustment. I think we see that in the pig and poultry industries at the moment, and in also the areas of food waste, and Robin Alders speaks very well on this topic, that we waste the most nutritious parts of the carcass and don't make full use of the protein that's available to us.
Yes, very good point. And I mean, I'm currently reading a book on regenerative agriculture, which claims that you can increase the soil carbon at the same time as increasing your stocking rate. So that's sort of a win-win. Christine Purdy has asked, could you comment on the relative importance of invasive animal species with respect to climate change and the role of veterinarians in proactively managing this risk?
I hadn't considered that aspect. Yeah, no, I'd have to reflect on that. Unless others have got comments on that, I'm happy to open up the discussion.
If anyone else wants to comment on that, otherwise it might be a question on notice. Well, we might move on. Someone might think of an answer there, and feel free if anyone wants to comment on anything. Sorry, Helen. Yes.
Yeah, I've been thinking about. I've got to discuss this at the Australian Veterinary Vertebrate Pest Conference that's coming up as a virtual conference in May, and in Australia, you have essentially desertification and deforestation being and consequent biodiversity loss being greatly assisted by invasive animals like rabbits and goats that were not here before European settlement. So the invasive animal situation, let alone mouse plagues and so on, impacting on food security. So I think there is there's a climate change aspect to that as well, in terms of where they move and how they move, and how they may be more suitable in some situations to surviving or adapting proactively to climate change than some of our domestic animals and agriculture. Yeah.
Okay. We might just interrupt here a little bit and ask everyone to put your videos on. We'd like to take a few screenshots just to record the afternoon. So if everyone can put their screens on, if you can. I think Alex from Vets for Climate Action is going to take some screenshots.
Yep, that's me. So if you're comfortable with your face being on this, it would just be something that we'll share on our social media pages to celebrate how many people turned up for this. If you're not comfortable with that, obviously you can leave your video off, that's fine. So big smiles. I'll take a few screenshots.
We'll have to do it a few times. There's about 3 screens.
Yep. The second one. And the last one. Great. Thanks so much, everyone.
No worries. Now we'll get on to, we've got a few more minutes or we can take some more questions. Are we looking at a future of mass factory farming in order to feed the human population? I think it relates to a question you've already answered, really, Mark.
Well, there is an argument that pigs and poultry are more efficient converters of feed into human food than ruminants. But by the same token, there's many environment types that are only suitable for ruminant conversion of cellulose into protein. I don't think that there's a one-size-fits-all solution, but I think the equation that we've done up until now has really excluded the environmental impacts. It's been very much focused on the economic benefit of adopting one agricultural system over another, and it needs to be a more fulsome equation.
All right, there's still quite a few questions on there. I don't think we'll get to them all. So Ben, can you make sure you record those so that we can maybe get back to people after?
Yep, we'll do, Ron.
Yeah. So there's a controversial one here from Claude asking about the elephant in the room, which is human, the human population growth and impact on climate change, and what can we do about that? It's probably a bit broader than the veterinary profession to address that one.
But I think the veterinary profession makes a contribution in addressing poverty and the sustainable development goals as communities are more affluent or at least comfortable and confident that they're going to survive into the next generation. There's less need for more children. There's greater education, and population growth slows, and that's a desirable thing.
But I suppose the thing that goes with that is increased resource usage per person, which is a problem. Rob Patterson asks, is there any direct contact the OIE has with international desertification reversal projects around the world?
Not directly. As I said, they've got 75 MOUs with other international bodies, and a few years ago did some work on pastoralism, looking at nomadic communities and some of the conflicts that arise out of that way of life, and but not directly with that aspect. No.
Yeah. Someone, Kay, not sure what the name is, Cruz, asking a question about the Australian and New Zealand veterinary associations getting together to develop a joint stance on climate action. But I'm aware that there's broader than that. There's a fair international movement in that area that you might want to comment on, Mark.
I think if we, it would be nice to see that type of leadership coming out of Australia and New Zealand. I think internationally, reputation is somewhat less than positive on climate change and response. And if we could show leadership out of the veterinary profession and addressing this as a One Health issue, I think that would be a very positive contribution, and I think it would be well regarded and very readily accepted by a number of other countries.
Yeah. Are there any countries, and someone asked, Al asked this, are there any other countries doing it particularly well that we could learn from?
Mostly in Europe, I think, and I think the challenge for us is to find a way to constructively engage in our own region in Asia and the Pacific, and to show that we've got something valuable to contribute and something meaningful to say, rather than trying to take it beyond our own neighbourhood.
And there's one question here we might have to finish on. Alison asked, how are we supposed to slowly change public perception of alternative protein sources to feed the humans, for example, insects? And I suppose just broaden that question out in terms of, what's our approach to changing the views of our leadership and ensuring we get appropriate policies and paradigm shifts.
Yeah, and I think what the platform of Vets for Climate Action has shown is that vets are thought leaders within their communities, that they're dealing one-on-one with owners and their pets, with farmers and their livestock, with public health practitioners and human illness. And I think that the modelling that we do personally at an individual or a practice level or as a profession is quite powerful, and I think it will bear fruit over time. Some of these issues are contentious. What people eat is a very fundamental issue to their identity, and it's not one that I think we should be preaching on. But simply pointing out that there are, whatever choice you make, whether it's intensive livestock or extensive livestock or alternate proteins, each of these has a cost, and there's no simple solution. And because of that, you need to have well-educated professionals and experts working in a One Health setting, because there's not a simple one-size-fits-all solution.
Okay, I think we'll have to start pulling up here. I'll just do a little bit of summing up. But firstly, thanks very much, Mark, for a fascinating presentation and the discussion. I think the discussion's been great. Personally, yes, so everyone, a nice clap. Thank you very much. Just to sum up, I think I've often pondered how to resolve Australia's inadequate climate policies. As a scientist, I find it often start talking about carbons in soils and disease vectors and emission reduction trajectories, etc. But really, climate change, in terms of the overall policy, it's no longer a scientific issue. There really isn't any debate on whether it's happening or not and the need for it, but it's more a political issue. So it's an issue of power and vested interests and etc. And how do we change that support base that our politicians, etc., have? So that's where organisations like ours have a huge opportunity. I think, as the example I gave at the start with the Indigenous people up in Torres Strait, when I was talking to them, they acknowledged that them taking a single action isn't going to make the difference. The difference is going to be made when a whole range of organisations keep up the pressure on governments for change. So, and as we talked about in the discussion, that's what we need to be doing as collectively as groups. We need to be advocating for change, but at the same time, as veterinarians, we can help our industries and communities adapt. So Veterinarians for Climate Action is really down that track of working collaboratively with various organisations and giving veterinarians a voice in terms of advocating for climate change. You know, there are various lots of volunteers within the organisation talking to heaps of politicians and attending events like this one. So we've just got to keep that all up. So importantly, we've got to leverage Australia's love of animals to hold conversation after conversation after conversation with everyday people to raise the awareness. Because after all, probably what's going to make a bigger difference than politicians is changing the mood of the public so that the pressure is brought on government for change. I volunteer some of my free time to Veterinarians for Climate Action and also the group of former chief veterinary officers. And the reason I do it is to make a difference to the world for my grandkids that they'll inherit. And personally, I refuse to accept that they need to carry the bulk of this burden that we've all created together. And then we've got to think about the billions of animals in the bushfires, etc., that Mark mentioned. So just to close, if you'd like to see more about the work that Vets for Climate Action is doing, certainly go to their social media pages, join the organisation if you feel like you'd like to do it. And if you want any further information, there's the email address that's in the chat there, info@vfca.org.au. And apart from that, I would just again like to thank Mark for his presentation today and being so honest with us and frank. So everyone, thanks Mark again.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, well, we'll close the session now. Thanks everyone for your attendance.